In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Grizzlies beat writer Drew Hill, joined as always by columnist Chris Herrington. We are inching ever so closely to the season, Chris. This is going to be a long month, I have since discovered, until we get to training camp. Not quite a month, I guess three weeks or so, 3+ weeks.
Right.
And it'll be really nice to be in Nashville for training camp and get to be around the team. And you and I, man, now you're all up in Minnesota. So we rarely cross paths anymore. But
I'll be heading back to town this weekend, though. So I'll be in town for several weeks.
Very nice. So I'm excited about that. Looking forward to it. We have a few things we're going to talk about today, Marcus Smart and a few other topics as we inch a little bit closer. At this stage of the offseason, do you feel like we've talked about everything we could possibly talk about?
Well, I think we've gone through all of things that have happened in the offseason. I mean, there's plenty to talk about leading up to the season. It's the kind of thing where, we got a long time between now and then. And so you sort of have to string it out a little bit.
I asked that not because we're still going to have plenty to talk about on this podcast, but it just feels like this is a particularly slow offseason for the NBA. Just in general. Like last year, it felt like we had the Damian Lillard stuff
right.
was carrying kind of the water a little bit. And there was at least enough movement, there was Wemby, like there was the Wemby anticipation, all of that. We don't have any of that this year. It's been really
cool. There's not a lot of uncertainty right now. I mean, we just had a Jamal Murray get a contract extension. It's sort of, this time of year, usually, in theory, like your all-season moves have wrapped up. There's questions about some contract extension stuff. And I don't think there's anything particularly dramatic on that front for the Grizzlies or anyone else, and the rest of the league feels fairly stable. You don't have, you have the Lillard situation. We've had other situations going into a season where there's some instability around some star players. You wonder how it will sort out. The closest thing we have to that right now is Brandon Ingram. I don't know if he qualifies. I don't think there are many casuals around the league, like, waiting at the edge of their seat to find out, whether Brandon Ingram's going to show up to training camp for the Pelicans or try to force a trade or whatever,
Yeah, Brandon Ingram doesn't quite move the needle, I don't think.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's also like this time of the year coincides with the start of football, which is obviously in America probably the biggest sport. So it always gets a little bit more quiet this time of year, I feel like. I guess you're now in an NFL town, huh? Are you a Vikings fan? Do you consider yourself now to be a Vikings fan?
I don't really have time to be much of a fan of anyone, or at least the mental energy relative to other things I can do with my time. I'm a quasi Packers fan. My best friend is a big Packers fan. And I think if you're from this area, you can't like the Packers and the Vikings, but I sort of can, I feel like I can. And so, but I wish well to both. I'm a little bit more of a Packers guy than a Vikings guy, I think.
Okay. Fair enough. But, I mean, I'm a Bears guy, so I actually wish I would have never asked that question, but that's okay.
Right.
All right, well, let's talk some Grizzlies. I've been doing a little bit of writing. I know last week we talked about Ja. I have some thoughts on the Marcus Smart stuff. I actually think I might be changing my mind a little bit about something involving Marcus Smart, just to tease here. When you look at Marcus Smart coming into the season overall, obviously he played a limited amount of games. The Grizzlies didn't really get to see what he looked like next to Ja for very long. The experiment never had a chance to fully play out. Do you have some level of expectations of what it's going to look like and if it's going to work?
Well, there's some level of belief outside in terms of hardcore national NBA people who aren't Memphis connected. You will detect some just sort of assumptions not even the right word. Some just assertions that, well, that didn't work out. The Marcus Smart thing was a miss. That didn't work out. And to me, the evidence is so inconclusive. I don't know how you reach that kind of a determination. And so to me, we talk about the whole last year being a gap year. It was a gap year on the Marcus Smart acquisition too. I mean, I just think we don't know. One of the interesting things about his season, he only played 20 games, and 20 games is a small sample, but you have to cut it in half because he the first 11 games he played, as a starting point guard, or at least starting guard, alongside Desmond Bane with John Morant not available, in a lineup that for most, if not all of that, was also starting Zaire Williams, who was having a terrible start to the season, and was starting either Xavier Tillman, who couldn't make a shot, or Bismack Biyombo, who couldn't catch the ball. And so the offense was a wreck. How much of that is a condemnation of Marcus Smart's abilities on the ball, and how much of it is a team context? But it didn't go well. But then you have the second half of it. The other 9 games he played were after John Morant's return, where he was playing more of the role they envisioned when they acquired him, where he's playing, mostly off the ball, some on the ball in the flow of the game, but he's not like a starting guard, or certainly a starting point guard. And that stuff went really well, actually. Like that looked good. Like the thing that they envisioned for him to be when he got to do it looked good. When you put it all together, look over the course of the season, like the team was a mess, but like they were better. Like he had one of the better on-off, numbers on the team. The team played better over the course of his 20 games with him than they did without him. A lot of the defensive metrics looked really good from him last year, even though the sample was small. The shooting was not, but like the shooting sort of is not with him. Like he's a career 38% from the floor and 32% from three. He's just an erratic shooter. That's what he is. And so to me, the jury's out. But there was evidence that when they put him in the kind of role they wanted him in, that it did have a more of a positive impact on the team than his own individual numbers would indicate. And that's sort of the story with Marcus Smart. Like, he's a guy who helps the team, even if his own individual numbers maybe don't look great. And so I think the jury's out there. I guess my 2 biggest questions on him, like going into the season, one would be like, what degree can he be effective in a point guard role if you want to play him in that role some? And then the second thing is sort of like, is he turning the corner? Because he just turned 30. This will be his age 30 season. He's got 10 years in the league. He's a smallish guard, 6'3", who plays a really physical style. There are injury questions there. He hasn't played. I think he's hit the 70 game mark once in the past 5 seasons. And in addition to like the 10 years in the league, he's got another year and a half of playoff basketball that he's played. He's played, 110 playoff games, which is more than a full season of wear and tear there. So I think the durability question and the can you be effective on the ball question, to me, are the biggest questions for Marcus Smart.
Yeah, I agree. And I was gonna get into the Vince versus Marcus conversation, but I since you went to the point about him playing on the ball.
So that at some point is like, I'll just tell you and tell the world now that is on my list of things I'm going to write in the lead up to the season. At some point, I'm going to do some compare and contrast Vince Williams, Marcus Smart, Kyle.
Well, so this will be an interesting conversation because I'm wondering if you'll end up eventually, don't rush it, Chris, but I'm wondering if eventually you'll end up at the same place that I think I'm going to end up. At least prior to the start of training camp. But your point about him playing on the ball is interesting because I think that does, I guess, have some sort of impact on how you use him, right? Because if Ja comes out of the game and he's playing with Vince, you would immediately put in Marcus. The one thing that I kind of discovered as I was going through it, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this is, Marcus has played a lot of seasons as a combo guard. If you go look at Cleaning the Glass, they've qualified him as a wing like the first 5 seasons of his career. They qualified him as a combo guard. Every season but one, he was considered to be a point guard based on where he's played. Last year, he shot the ball much better as a shooting guard than he did as a point guard, but that is not the case every single year. I don't know how much of a impact that actually has. What I found to be really interesting is that if you look at him in the minutes he has played as a point guard over the course of his career, especially over these last 5 years, The one thing that he stylistically does a lot differently than both Ja Morant and Scottie Pippen Jr. and Desmond Bane is he doesn't attack the basket as much. Like he was only taking 19% of his shots at
Right.
the rim. All those other guys are shooting well over 25% of the frequency of shots at the rim, which means stylistically the what you're trying to do may change if you put Marcus Smart in there as your
Right.
backup point guard. And to me, I think he's passed the ball better over the course of his career as a wing or as a two guard. He's shot the ball slightly better. Again, I don't know how much that actually matters. And he's played a lot of both. And I just think that for this team, fits better on the wing than he does as the backup point guard.
Well, it's an interesting question and you hope you don't have to confront this nearly as much next season, obviously, but how do you play? Who do you play with, and how do you play when John Morant's not in the game? And that's sort of a big question for the Grizzlies in terms of navigating 48 minutes, 82 games. Again, you hope you get, 32 minutes and 72 games of John Morant in that, and then you don't have to deal with it as much. But even in a best case scenario, you got to deal with that a lot. Like, how do you play when John Morant's not in the game? And there's no Tyus Jones anymore, who was an easy answer to that question. And so, to your point, if you want to play a similar style, not the same quality, but a similar style, when John Morant's out of the game, your best bet's going to be Scottie Pippen, who more mimics that style in terms of being able to get into the paint and sort of, collapse the defense and pressure the rim. He's much more of a pressure of the rim guard. And frankly, even at this stage, Derrick Rose is more of a pressure of the rim guard than Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart, to your point, is not going to play that way at all. I mean, Desmond Bane's going to play that way more than Marcus Smart will. And so, I think it's an interesting question of how the Grizzlies choose to navigate the non-John Morant minutes. And there's a question of, can they be successful? And I don't, even if you want to put Marcus Smart on the ball, I don't classify Marcus Smart as a point guard. I classify Scottie Pippen that way. I classify Tyus Jones that way. I classify Jacob Gilyard that way. I'll even classify Derrick Rose that way. And so when you talk about can you survive, much less thrive, in non-point guard minutes, that means lineups without John Morant or Scottie Pippen or Derrick Rose on this team. I think that's a real question for the Grizzlies. I think the Grizzlies feel like the answer to that is yes. That's the way they've constructed the team. But between Marcus Smart, Desmond Bane, Luke Kennard, Vince Williams Jr., can you get by with combinations of those guys without a point guard? And if not, that really raises the question on like the Scottie Pippen role and the Marcus Smart role and sort of the relationship between those things. And if you go back over the last 4 or 5 years, it's sort of a mixed record. They were really good. To go back to the 56 win, the We Hear Grizzlies, they played a lot that season without John Morant or Tyus Jones on the floor, and they were really good. It was mostly because they were phenomenal on defense and they were good enough. They were close to average on offense. Well, that was D'Anthony Melton. It was Kyle Anderson. It was Dylan Brooks sharing those minutes with Desmond Bane. And so I don't know whether this group, this roster, can create that same kind of effectiveness without a point guard on the floor. To me, that's a real open question.
I think it is a real open question. I still think that Bane is the best option. Listen, if you're looking for the most seamless transition from Ja to the next point guard, I think the answer is Scottie Pippen. Simply because I think it allows you, as you mentioned, stylistically, statistically, analytically, it is the closest thing you're going to get because the style of play doesn't have to change all that much from player to player. Now, I'm not saying Scottie is John Morant at all. I'm just saying that he wants to get to the basket first. That doesn't mean you can't change the way that you play over the course of a basketball game either, right?
Right.
When you have a different lineup in there, you play the game a little bit differently. But I don't know if that's healthy, especially if the goal this year is to get back to, and it looks like, the Grizzlies have signaled this all offseason especially when they drafted Zach Edey, that's something that they want to do. And so to me, I just don't know if playing Marcus Smart as the backup point guard in that role is going to be as effective as using Desmond Bane or Scottie Pippen. In fact, I don't think it's going to be quite as effective. And so for me, I think it's a really interesting conversation, and it brings us to the Vince thing. which defensively, you want one of those guys in the starting lineup because of their defense, not because of offense, if we're being honest about it. The offense you can just throw out. And positionally, where Marcus Smart plays, I don't think matters. That's really only an offensive thing. Marcus Smart's going to be asked to defend the best wing, so we're strictly talking offense there.
I think the defensive role of either of those guys is the same defensive role in that starting lineup.
Right.
Go guard the best dude, with few exceptions. Maybe not Nikola Jokic, but for the most part, you're just guarding the best dude.
So on Vince versus Marcus Smart, I think your case for starting Marcus Smart is this is your general broad case. He's a leader on the team. He's a veteran who's experienced. He guards up against players bigger than him very well. And I think his aggressiveness paired with Ja is a big plus. I mean, the same can be said about Vince. And so I think regardless, both of these guys are going to play a lot of minutes, I would guess. But if you're going to say why Smart should start, I think that's where it comes from. If you're going to say Vince Williams should start, I think you either think he's a better player at this stage of his career, and so he should just start because of that. He's less experienced, and because it makes more sense to bring Marcus Smart off the bench because he can fill that role behind Ja Morant. I think that those are the two things. So then I looked at their defense. So I want to acknowledge up front, these are not perfect, but I just found this to be interesting. Last year, on-off, we're going to talk on-off numbers here. So last year, lineups with Marcus Smart on the floor, Vince Williams off the floor. So only Marcus Smart. Opponents' effective field goal percentage, 53.7%, 1,068 possessions. The opposite of that, Williams on the court, Smart off the court. Opponents, 55.2%, so down a little bit, but more than double the amount of possessions, 2,636. So obviously not a fair comparison, totally different sample sizes, but slight edge to Marcus Smart there. But if you want to look at when they're both on the court, opponent effective field goal percentage 49.7%, so really good, only on 197 total possessions. And lastly, and I think this might be the most important part of this, is I wanted to look specifically at how they played, and I knew it was going to be a small sample, but with the closest thing that you could get to what we project the Grizzlies starting lineup to be. And for me, that was Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson, and Bismack Biyombo, and then Marcus Smart or Vince Williams. So Vince Williams on the court with that group, opponent's effective field goal percentage, 50.7%, 74 possessions. Smart on the field with that group, 54.4%, 115 possessions. I just threw a lot of numbers at you. Basically, over the course of the whole season, Vince Williams' defense, his on-off numbers when on the court defensively was slightly worse than Marcus Smart, who played a lot fewer games. But with the best lineup, Vince Williams was a little bit better. So to me, that is interesting. And then you have to think about that while also thinking about where they fit. And to me, I think I'm landing on I would rather Marcus Smart be in the starting lineup.
You're making me feel like I'm back in French class in high school in the sense that I'm better at reading it than hearing it. You
will be.
Right. If I was looking at the numbers, I could process it a little bit better than just having it just like all thrown at me in a podcast form. I would say, I guess, that I may arrive at a similar conclusion, but my process, I think, to get there is going to be different from you. I don't. To me, the problem with those sort of team performance numbers is the samples are so small, and the context is going to be so different. Marcus Smart played 20 games on a team that was a mess. Vince Williams only played like 50 on a team that was a mess and hadn't really played ever until that. And I feel like, and this is me, this is more eyeball for me than anything numbers wise. I feel like the defensive difference, setting aside one particular part of defense I'm going to get to in a second, I think the defensive difference is, I believe, is going to be minimal. I think they will play a similar role with similar effectiveness defensively. And so I look at it more in terms of offense and in terms of rebounding. And so the two things I look at, when you think about, I'm assuming Zach Edey's starting. When you look at Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson, Zach Edey, now you got to add one guy to that group. I'm interested in how much do I need the rebounding. Zach Edey, I think, is going to be a big-time rebounder, but Jaren isn't. And so I think I want my small forward to pitch in on the boards, particularly on the defensive boards. And again, the samples are small last season. Marcus Smart historically has never been a particularly good rebounder, so I think his samples are probably sort of in line with what is normal for him. But last year, Vince Williams' defensive rebound rate was 16.3. Marcus Smart's was 7.2. That's more than double.
Yep.
But I'll put it in a little bit better context, setting numbers aside. Vince Williams' defensive rebound rate last season was higher than Jaren Jackson's, Xavier Tillman's, or Brandon Clark's. Marcus Smart's defensive rebound rate was lower than Scottie Pippen Jr.'s, Luke Kennard's, or Derrick Rose's. There's a real big difference in terms of how much rebounding help I think you're going to get from those two guys. And then the other thing, and to me, this is a little less clear, but I look at three-point shooting, particularly off-ball three-point shooting, particularly three-point shooting from the corners. Like, what's the real role your small forwards playing in this offense when you're playing with John Morant will have the ball, Desmond Bane will have the ball, Jaren will have the ball, Zach Edey's going to be a finisher at a minimum. You know, the sample was super small with Vince Williams, but it was pretty good. He shot, I think, 38% overall from three last season. Marcus Smart's 32% on his career. So how real was the Vince Williams shooting? I think we don't know that, but I think we know that Marcus Smart is a 32% three-point shooter.
Yes.
Both of them took more above the break than from the corners last season. Vince shot it better from the corners. So I think there's more potential for him in the context of the team to grow as that corner catch and shoot guy. I think Marcus Smart at this stage of his career, I don't know if the performance is going to be different than it's been. And there's a slight difference in terms of catch and shoot versus pull up. They both, I get numbers from him, I can't remember, but if you look at that, it veers slightly more in the Vince Williams direction, but not like aggressively. But I just sort of believe in not only was his performance better in, I think, not only the overall shooting, but the shooting areas, I think that matter in that role last season. But I just think there's more potential to grow into that role, whereas I think Marcus Smart won't. And so that's the two things I think I'm really going to look at from an on-court standpoint is defensive rebounding and the off-ball shooting, the spacing. And I feel like Vince Williams fits more there. I do think the stature, locker room, stuff matters. I don't want to be dismissive of that. I do think that matters. I think that probably really leans in the Marcus Smart direction pretty heavily. And then the other thing that I think is harder to get into is the on-court chemistry stuff, right? Like, Marcus Smart looked good on the floor with John Morant and Desmond Bane, and having his ability, having his veteran experience on the floor with those guys, having his ability, just sort of, I think this Williams does this too, but Marcus Smart's got a long history doing this, just to make plays, to make plays in the moment, do what's needed in the moment. I think it's a little bit of a tough call. I do think Vince Williams is a cleaner fit on paper, I think, for the rebounding and the shooting reasons. But to me, it's not an obvious call.
Yeah. I guess I threw all those numbers, that jumble of numbers out there to kind of say, look at how close this is defensively.
Sure.
This is so close. And I actually think at this stage, Vince, surely, I think you're right about growing into that role, has a higher ceiling of what he could be this season if his development continues the way that it has over the last 2 years. Could be just a better player for the Grizzlies this year. That's certainly a possibility. What I found interesting was, if that is the choice, do you still use Marcus Smart off the bench, but you don't use him off the bench as the backup point guard? I think that's another question there, because I don't think I like that fit after looking into it a little bit more. And the other thing, I looked at the 3-point shooting as well, because to me, if Marcus Smart's going to be out there with Ja and those guys, it's not just important that he makes threes. It's just really important that he makes the wide open ones, right?
Right.
And one of the concerning things is when you go at the NBA stats website and you can look up closest defender 3-point numbers on wide open threes. 2 or 4 seasons ago and 3 seasons ago, he was shooting 38%. And then this last year, that number has taken a dip. So you do wonder, is he on the decline? I'm not suggesting that he is. I don't think that players at his age
Right.
typically hit their decline at this stage, but it's, I think, a fair question. And so, um, to me, I find all that interesting. And I think the reason that I'm eventually going to land on, I think Marcus Smart should just start, is because I don't like him as the backup point guard, and I don't think that they're going to bring him off the bench to play on the wing. And so I think it fits better to just have him play on the wing with Ja and those starters and run the experience out there and give that a try. But this is going to be an interesting conversation for sure as we get closer
Yeah.
season. Okay, let's take a quick pause for a message from our sponsor.
Want to make a big impact without getting lost in a big system? Join Youth Villages to be a force for families while becoming part of one. Help make positive changes on a national scale, one community at a time. It takes a family to transform lives. Start with yours. Apply now at youthvillages.org/careers.
So we talked a little bit about Scotty earlier. How much do you suspect he's going to get minutes right out the gate, as a two-way player, or do you think that this is going to be somebody that backfills when players are out? Where do you think he's going to fall?
The Gigi Jackson absence, I mean, creates more of an opening. I sort of feel like Jake LaRavia is more in line for that, but you could have a trickle-down effect in terms of the other stuff. I think they probably need to try to find out, and maybe they can find this out in training camp and preseason instead of on into the season, whether they think they can get by or thrive or do as well as they want to or need to without a point guard on the floor, like we were talking about earlier. Because if not, you may have to have Scottie Pippen. If the non-Ja lineups aren't working without, with some combo of Bain, Smart, Kennard, Vince Williams in your backcourt, and you just need more of a setup, get into the paint, touch paint kind of point guard, you may not have a choice. And so my thing is partly the Marcus Smart, like stature thing is one thing. I'm wary of the Derrick Rose stature thing. I hope it's one thing if they're not playing Scottie Pippen in deference to Marcus Smart, Luke Kennard, Vince Williams, and trying to see if that stuff works. But if they feel like they need more of a point guard in the mix and they're playing Derrick Rose over Scottie Pippen, that's something I will have less patience with, I think. I do think they need to play Pippen enough. They need to play Pippen enough to determine, and maybe they already have internally, I don't know. I have not yet. Summer League is not enough. They need to play Pippen enough to determine whether he is worthy of a main roster spot before they give him a main roster spot. And so there is that part of it. You need to find out at some point this season, they're probably going to elevate one of these two-way guys. And part of that may be who fits the biggest need, but it also needs to be the guy who's worth it. They have this thing where they've done this in the past, and I think we all feel like, Vince Williams, Gigi Jackson were worth it. The new contract they gave Conchar is probably a mistake, but elevating him into the main roster was not a mistake. He's a legit player. But then they do it with Killian Tilly, and they end up cutting him, right? You do it with Kenneth Lofton earlier than you really needed to, probably, and you end up cutting him. So whenever they elevate one of these guys, whether that's Pippen, Cam Spencer, or Jay Huff, I don't want it just to be, this is our position of need. If you're given a contract, I want it to be a guy worth the contract. And so I want to find that out about these guys before I give the contract.
Yeah, I agree. I think based on what we've seen from him, he does seem like
I feel good about him, but to me, it's not it's not, to me, he is not fully established it yet.
I think what he does possess, and that's defensive on-ball defense, is going to be useful no matter what in the NBA. It's like the flamethrowers off the bench that can come in and make shots, maybe a little bit more popular, but they may be less worth it in terms of using a real contract on that type of player. I think you can bet on him playing good defense on a nightly basis, and the staff really likes that about him. And I feel you also got to think about it this way too. Jason March, who's now on the staff, has investment in him as well.
Sure.
Yes.
Well, if you look at the lineup data from last season, and we were talking about, the non-point guard lineups, and again, I'm including Marcus Smart as non-point guard in this stuff. If you look at that, and again, these are all small samples, and they're all small samples on a team that was just a wreck. So don't, take it for what it's worth. But if you look at the lineup data last season, there's a lot of it of no point guards. And then you look at the lineup data of Scottie Pippen as the point guard, which is smaller. Defense is the difference. They actually didn't get better on offense. They got a little bit worse on offense in those lineups. There may be a lot of noise in that, but they got measurably better on defense. So that's actually where the difference was. And so, part of it is like, when Ja's off the floor, the defense needs to get better because the offense is not going to get better probably, but the defense needs to get better with the Ja off the floor minutes. And like Pippen's on-ball defense might like really help that happen,
Yeah. It is interesting to go through the stats too, because like, especially on-off stats, if you include Vince, there's so many lineups, with all due respect, that were just terrible lineups that he played with that just don't necessarily reflect, his effort. And so, yeah, it is all a little bit of a jumble. I feel good though about where Scottie Pippen is. Okay, last couple things. We talked about Marcus Smart and Vince Williams. We talked about Ja. Is there anything else that you are thinking about as this team goes to camp? Like I tried to jot down like the 5 biggest things that I could think of as these teams as they go to camp. And I'm just curious if there's anything that you are thinking about that I haven't noted yet.
Well, I do think the biggest question in terms of lineups and rotations is probably who because I do think Zach Edey is a higher probability to start than Marcus Smart. And so the starting lineup spot I think that is most up in the air is probably that small forward spot or that third perimeter spot. And then to the point of the conversation we've been having, like whatever decision is made there's trickle down effects to how you manage your rotation. And so how they manage the perimeter lineup and rotation is probably the biggest question. Zach Edey, we haven't seen. He's played 40 minutes of summer league basketball. That's it. So he's obviously intriguing. And I'm interested to see, if there is an opening for another wing, if it's not going to be Pippen, Kennard, Marcus Smart all in the rotation. If there's opening for another wing with Gigi out, like is Jake LaRavia gonna win that coming out of camp? Or is he going to struggle? And then, the guy we just don't talk about anymore, although we mentioned him once on this pod, like John Conchar, he's just there waiting,
Yeah, he is. He is. He might sneak his way back in there. You know what? Right. I was thinking about this too. It doesn't feel like we've had a Grizzlies season like this. I know I haven't covered the team nearly as long as you have, but this feels different. Like this is just a different position that the team is in going into the season. And I'm curious what the message is going to be. Are they going to embrace we got something to prove, or we're upset that, people think we fell off, or are they going to come in and act like, no, that's not important to us. We're right there with everybody else and we know it. I think that'll be interesting to see what kind of psyche we get from them.
Well, there's definitely never been a Memphis Grizzlies season like this for a couple reasons, I guess. They're related. Dropped my mic. One is that there's never been a gap year. We don't know whether last year was a gap year. That's not established until it's not, right? Until you get back. But there's never been a dip. There's been the team's bad, and then it gets good for a little while, then gets bad for a little while, and that sort of like longer up and down arc. There hasn't been sort of a dip, within a longer period of good play, which is what we think last year was. And there's never been a Grizzlies team that got good, they got that good that fast. When you win 56 games with, a bunch of 22-year-olds leading the way, like that had never happened before. So it's sort of uncharted territory. So you have a team that I think is a higher ceiling than any other team. I don't mean necessarily this season, but this era has a higher upside than before in franchise history. And you have like this in the middle of what you think is a long run of being good. You had a year where things fell apart. I mean, the team did have in the grit and grind era, they did have a year where everything fell apart. The famous, they set the record for most players in a season back then before they reset it again this past season. That was different because it happened late enough in the year that they made the playoffs anyway. Like they took a ruined team into the playoffs and got swept, but they built up enough wins that, they got there. But also it was towards the end of the run anyway. And so people knew that the better days were not going to be ahead in that era. They were still just trying to hold on. And so that was a little bit of a dip, but it didn't dip down as far with the same potential to bounce back is what we're going through right now.
I do wonder if there's a lot at stake. Like if they don't come out and prove that they are competitive in that way, you know, I don't know if 1 year is enough to derail it, but it would actually be two because this season was wasted. This last season was wasted, and I don't know. It feels like there is some at stake here to prove that they are still competitive.
Oh, I think if we get, let's say, 30 games into the season and the team is like, a game under 500 or whatever, and it's not because of massive injuries, I think that has the potential to be very volatile. I don't think that's likely to happen, but I think if something like that were to happen, and certainly doubt creeps in about whether the infrastructure you have can get back into the contending mix, I think that could get volatile in a hurry. But also, I really think that's unlikely to happen if the core players are healthy.
I would agree. I think that this team is going to be very close to a 50-win team this year again, but I mean they do enter with something to prove for sure this season. I don't think we ever discussed the schedule, Chris. We never even got into that.
Yeah, I was out of the country when it came out. I did write my annual consumer's guide, which published shortly after I got back. But I think we were on a little podcasting hiatus when that happened.
Do you have it in front of you? Do you happen to recall the big games that you mentioned? Because I made a list of 5 while you were out of the country, and I'm sure you did not see it. We're crunched for time here, but
so a bummer for me, obviously, that we only get the one game at Minnesota instead of the 2. Jeff Calkins on my radio hit said, to accuse me of being a tough grader. I think this is the easiest grader I've ever been. I went back and looked at it. I had 6 4-star games, but I had 16 3.5-star games. I had more than half the schedule, at least 3.5 stars. I think I was a little soft on them. But, I'm interested in, the NBA is trying to get a do-over with John Morant versus Anthony Edwards. You got 2 national TV games of Grizzlies Wolves. The OKC game, I think we're all hoping for a big OKC rivalry that's going to materialize. And just a game that jumps out to me as particularly interesting is going to be like when the Knicks come to town, because I think the Knicks are really fun and high profile in a way they haven't been in a long time, and they come to town on a Friday night. I think that's maybe an underrated game.
Okay, so do you have it in front of you?
A little bit, yeah.
You rated these games. Okay, Orlando, home opener, that's a big one, obviously.
That's one of my 6 4-stars, yeah.
Okay. New Orleans the day after Thanksgiving. That's a good one. That's always
I think I have it the 3.5 just because I'm growing less interested in New Orleans generally, but yeah, obviously a good game.
I mean, Marcus Smart getting an actual return to Boston is fun. The Grizzlies literally can't beat Boston. I think they've won 2 of the last 10 or something like that. They've lost 6 in a row. And they had
I'm pessimistic about the quality of the basketball against the Celtics.
Yeah, but I don't know. That has potential to be fun. Obviously, Martin Luther King Day, Minnesota, that was one of your high ones, I'm guessing.
Yep.
And then I really think that a Saturday home game in March against San Antonio is pretty fun with Wemby coming to town.
I think the Spurs games and the Rockets games both have high potential to be really interesting games. Yeah.
So those are the 5 I came up with. So it sounds like we're mostly on the same page there. So yeah, I'm pretty excited. I think the Grizzlies aren't exactly enamored with the fact that they're leaving for the All-Star break and they're on the road and coming back and they're on the road again. That kind of stinks, but at least they're not playing on Christmas this year. And their longest road trip comes over New Year's after that. So there are good parts of the schedule, I think, that broke well for the Grizzlies, but that is pretty tough. Some of the breaks and the long road trips, I don't think
they start on the road with those first 2 games, but then they come home with 4 games in 6 days. I think that 4 games in 6 days early on, it's going to be a good, let's get acquainted session with the team.
Yeah, it'll be a good gear up before we get to next season. I guess we get into the thick of the season, I should say. That's going to do it for us. We will be back next week talking more Memphis Grizzlies. We're getting closer and closer here. Chris and I will be at training camp in Nashville, so fired up about that. Like I said, just a little over 3 weeks away from there. So until next time, as always, thanks for listening. For Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.